The Beyonder's back, ladies and gentlemen, and that's not even the main thing that happens in this story. This story's crazy, or at least this issue's crazy, right? So here's what this does. This initially opens up with the Avengers facing off against a guy named the Autocrat. He doesn't matter, he's ultimately defeated by She-Hulk, whatever, who cares? The thing about this is this story takes place immediately after the events of All Out Avengers. We didn't cover the entirety of that because there were only select moments in that story that were important. We'll talk more about that later on when we get to the main villain that's being introduced here, who's basically the new god of Marvel Comics. It's crazy. But what ends up happening is that once the Autocrat is overtaken, the Avengers are brought by Iron Man and T'Challa to a new room that they've never seen before in Avengers Tower. And the thing about this is that even when the Avengers say, like, we've never been in this room before, the response of Iron Man and Black Panther is, neither have we. Now, if you guys notice, there's like this kind of monologue that's being offered, right? These blue squares with white letters. That is the Beyonder talking. We know that from All Out Avengers. We know the Beyonder's back. We've known that for a while. But the thing about this is he's always kind of talking about how there's a main event that's taking place, something that's transpiring, and what he's been doing or had been doing during the events of All Out Avengers is altering reality around the Avengers themselves to create these weird and wonky circumstances in the hopes of changing their perception of the world and kind of bringing their mind to newer heights so they can face off against greater threats than they've ever encountered before. One of the things to remember is that at the end of All Out Avengers, Captain America figured out the Beyonder was the one who had been manipulating reality around them, right? There was literally this moment where he was standing in a room by himself and directly addresses the Beyonder because he was seemingly the only one who had ever done anything like this before from Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2, so the MO made perfect sense. And so what had happened here is Black Panther and Iron Man had basically worked on this system that would be able to detect an energy source and then force that energy source to enter into its physical form. The problem here is that any time the Avengers came close in the All Out Avengers storyline to figuring out that Beyonder was the one behind all this, he would alter reality around them again. So they would basically lose whatever momentum they'd gained. And so by working separately, as far as the Beyonder was concerned, they were just kind of doing individual things and working on individual projects, and he was none the wiser. Secretly, they were working on two halves of the same machine, and they basically pressed a button when they were completed, and the machine teleported to this current location and effectively assembled itself. And then once the Beyonder realizes what's going on, it's too late. The machine's turned on, and the Beyonder is yanked out and pulled into a physical form. Now, here's the thing about this, right? For those of you guys who are not familiar with the Beyonder, this guy is as close as you get to God as anybody ever has been in the history of Marvel Comics. There's two versions of Beyonder, right? You have what's called pre-retcon Beyonder and the modern day Beyonder. Pre-retcon is the level of power he had in Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2 before you get to the unofficial Secret Wars 3. You'll find a link to that playlist down in the comments section so you can basically see exactly what I'm talking about and understand the change that Marvel made when they reduced his power. But one of the things that Jonathan Hickman had done in Avengers and New Avengers is he had returned both the Beyonder and the Beyonders, his whole race, back to the level of power they had at the beginning of all things, which is why you saw the Beyonders wiping out the cosmic entities at the end of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run. Literally, it was a massacre. Hank Pym's just like out in space trying to find out where the incursions, like how it's all starting, and he sees the Beyonders killing like Eternity, Infinity, Oblivion, Master Order, Lord Chaos. They kill the Living Tribunal. It's nuts. It's one of the most insane moments ever in the history of the comic. Oh God, I love that point in Marvel Comics. But the thing about this is that once the Beyonder re-emerges, he immediately panics and starts to freak out because what he says is, you have no idea what you've done. I've been trying to help you. I've been trying to help you by putting you through the paces, through all these crazy escapades and whatnot, giving you different levels of power or different tools that you can use because you have no clue what's coming. There's a reason I've been hiding, and I'm hiding from that guy. That's something to understand here. The Beyonder, this being of astronomical power, is hiding from someone because they're so much more powerful than he is that he can't even begin to compare. And that's when he starts to spill the beans on what's going on, right? He says, before the Omniverse came into being, there was the Lost One. The Lost One created the Beyonders, much like they would later do with me. He imbued my people with the tiniest fraction of his power. He watched with interest as my people grew jealous and then resentful, and he watched as they plotted against him. When they attacked, he allowed it, curious to see what would happen. This turned out to be a mistake, realizing too late the genuine threat they posed. The Lost One could do little as they stole the rest of his power. Now, there is something that I do want to talk about here for a second, and that's Defenders Beyond by Al Ewing. And the reason for this is because this story is not written by Al Ewing. This is written by Derek Landy. And the reason why that's so important is because in Al Ewing's Defenders Beyond, what he stated is that the Beyonders were actually created by the Celestials. So we've got an inconsistency here. Now, what we don't know, and this is one of the things you just kind of have to wait and see in Marvel Comics, is which one Marvel goes with. This summer, actually I think it's in the fall, one of the big things that's taking place this year is that Jonathan Hickman is coming back to Marvel Comics to basically write a story about Marvel's gods. What in effect it seems like he's going to do is completely rework and restructure the nature of the cosmic hierarchy in Marvel Comics. So we'll have a definitive understanding of where people rank in terms of the level of power they have, who's in continuity, who's out of continuity, that kind of thing. So all you can really do right now, if you are reading Marvel Comics, is just kind of take this as potentially one possibility of where the Beyonders actually came from, that neither answer seems to be definitively right. But what is important here, assuming that we take this as an absolute truth, is the Beyonders are not native to their own source of power. And this flies in the face of everything we know about the Beyonders, right? So a little bit of explanation here for those of you guys who aren't familiar with the nature of the Beyonders, their power, different things like that. When the Beyonder was first introduced in Marvel Comics, he was just kind of a one-off in the Secret Wars story, and that was it. But Secret Wars proved to be so popular, they brought him back. And then that was all we really got, right? It was like the Beyonder Secret Wars Part 2, and that was it. It wasn't until you got to the Fantastic Four story that was kind of the unofficial Secret Wars 3 that you learned the Beyonder is simply one member of a race called the Beyonders, and they exist beyond all space and time, outside of the multiverse. Now, that was kind of the standard going forward for years. There wasn't really any indication or reconciliation between the Beyonder and the Beyonders outside of the fact that the Beyonder was part of their race and for whatever reason was interested in the multiverse in Marvel Comics. When Jonathan Hickman came along in Avengers and New Avengers, what he basically said is the original Beyonder from Secret Wars, the one you see here right now, this one was like a child, right? A baby more or less, that had kind of been created inadvertently when the Molecule Man Owen Reese had basically conducted his experiment and created a cosmic cube by accident. And in doing so, half the energy went into Owen Reese, the other half went out and became the Beyonder. The Beyonder's source of power was never really explained. It was always just a level of power that they had that made them incredibly powerful. Al Ewing in Defenders Beyond explained that by saying their level of power was given to them by the Celestials so that if another war broke out between the Celestials, the Beyonders could put the kibosh on it, right? And just end the threat like that so it wouldn't lead to the destruction of the multiverse again. And so it's just kind of been that way ever since. This is a whole new explanation, right? The fact that there is a singular being out there who had such an astronomical level of power that the Beyonders stole that power from him and then dispersed it among themselves and used it for their own ends. Now, the funny thing about this is that as is explained here, the Lost One cannot be traditionally killed or destroyed in seemingly any conceivable way. We're not told why. We're simply just told that's the case. And so they basically imprisoned him on a moon that existed outside the Omniverse. Now, one of the things that I want to explain here is that in Marvel, in more recent years, Omniverse and Multiverse are just two words to describe the same thing. It didn't used to be that way. The Omniverse used to be a collection of multiverses, and in fact, the Omniverse was kind of the unofficial comic book explanation for the collection of the DC Comics multiverse and the Spawn multiverse and the Marvel multiverse and any other multiverse that exists out there as a giant collection of multiverses. But again, in this day and age, Marvel seems to be using multiverse and omniverse as interchangeable terms. But of course, with him being imprisoned, what ended up happening here is somewhere along the line, he basically broke out, and that what he's been doing is traveling around the multiverse, killing any Beyonder he finds, absorbing their power into himself, or any force that the Beyonders send after him in order to try to destroy him. But the bigger point the Beyonder makes is that he and his race are just fleeing for their lives and hiding away from this guy as best as they possibly can. So what we thought was at one point these astronomically powerful gods are hiding from someone even more powerful. What I'm hoping you're noticing here, particularly if you're reading Marvel as a whole and have been for the last couple years, the entire hierarchy is being thrown in disarray. A good example, the one above all is no longer the most powerful being in Marvel Comics anymore. We know that from Defenders Beyond, right? The Crown, or whatever it is that he's called, the Enigma, is the most powerful being out there in Marvel right now. But the funny thing about this is that when the Avengers ask, so why are you here? The response to the Beyonder is, so you can help me fight this war. And the Avengers are kind of like, what are you even talking about, man? Like, so you're literally telling us that there is a guy out there whose level of power dwarfs the power of you, and you were a guy who popped up on the scene and like killed death in our universe, and the cosmic entities had no choice but to go to the Molecule Man Owen Reese and ask him for help because they were helpless to stop you, right? That took place in Secret Wars 2. Like, you're that guy, and you think we can help you defeat this other dude? What are you talking about, man? Like, I mean, if we can find a peaceful resolution, sure, I guess, but like, we can't win a war against a force like that. Like, what could we do? Harsh language? You get the Infinity Gauntlet, cross our fingers, and hope for the best? Like, I mean, there's nothing we can do here. And the response of the Beyonder is simply, I've given you whatever tools you need to succeed. But in the midst of all this, where he initially allies himself with the Avengers and says, I will help you fight this war, and presumably I'll gather the other Beyonders and we will try to do the same, they're suddenly met by the arrival of Tiamak. Now here's the thing, Tiamak was introduced in All Out Avengers issue number 4, but the reason why I didn't cover it at the time is because it didn't seem to serve a real purpose. The only thing that happened is like Tiamak showed up and beat the crap out of Carol Danvers, which was kind of amazing to see, but all we saw with her was that like at the end of the comic, she had approached just this crazy, wild looking dude who of course we now know to be the Lost One, and like that was it. There was no context to the situation, so it just didn't really make any sense to cover it at the time. But the idea behind this is that Tiamak is basically an emissary of the Lost One. As it was explained in Avengers Beyond number 4, she's like his right hand, right? So like his top person that he basically sends out. But the funny thing about this is that Thor stands to her alongside Carol Danvers, and this girl crushes them both. This is what's so wild about this, right? Under any normal circumstance, a villain showing up and facing off against the Avengers, I mean, it's cool, and you get to see like a bit of a battle. This girl, it's not even really a battle so much as child's play, right? It's her just kind of keeping herself entertained at the moment. This chick isn't even really trying, but she's single-handedly crushing the entirety of the Avengers by herself. But ultimately, she ends up achieving her goal. And this happens when she pulls a dagger and is able to cut the Beyonder. And when that happens, as he bleeds, she says it's done. That because of her actions here, that basically injuring him, his blood has now spilt in the physical realm, which means now, she literally says, if you use your powers in any way, right, if you leave this planet's atmosphere, he will know. He will know exactly where you're at. So the best thing you can do here is to stay and hide. Now, this may seem arbitrary. It may seem like Derek Landy is kind of pulling this out of nowhere. This is actually not true. He's borrowing a page out of the old Silver Surfer comics from back in the day. And anybody who's familiar with Marvel Comics would tell you that. So for those of you guys who don't know, in the original Galactus trilogy in the Fantastic Four, when Galactus first popped up, at the end of the story, the Silver Surfer actually turned against him. And so what it did is it forced Galactus, or at least drove Galactus, to imprison the Silver Surfer on Earth. And what it did is that kicked off the Silver Surfer solo series, where he was basically traveling around the world, working alongside different superheroes, learning about humanity, different things like that. It was a resoundingly successful, and even to this day, still holds up as a phenomenal comic book. It's amazing. But this is where Derek Landy's getting this from, right? Quite literally, Beyonder is made a prisoner of Earth. More so than that, and kind of what feeds into the plot, he can't necessarily use his powers, right? He can't say, okay, well then I'll snap my fingers and I'll help you guys defeat this guy and we'll call together all the different ones, so on and so forth. Instead, he has to go back to his incorporeal form and just kind of remain in hiding at different places on Earth. And that's it, because the instant he leaves, that's all there is to it. Now, where Tiamak is locked up by the Avengers and basically put inside of a prison that'll basically hold her, the main concern the Avengers have now is what's going to happen if this guy sends more forces after us. And that's exactly what he's doing. Specifically, the Lost One is sending a reformed and presumably cosmically amplified version of the Cull Obsidian. Supergiant, Black Dwarf, the Ebony Maw, Corvus Glaive, these guys are all coming after him. So it's gonna be kind of amazing. But with that being said, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. I'm loving this story so far, and I will catch you all later. Peace.